Welcome, everyone, to Ending the Pay Gap, Learning from the Experience of Ontario. My name is Molly McCracken, and I'm your host here, and I'm very pleased to have Fay Faraday here from the Ontario Equal Pay Coalition to talk with us. And I'm going to just give some introductory remarks before we start off here, and also just give a couple more minutes for people to join here. I see we have about 14 people here so far. So that's great. Welcome, everybody. Um, Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you here from Winnipeg, which is located on Treaty 1 territory and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We acknowledge that our work takes place on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Anininu, Dakota and Dene people, and the homeland of the Red River Métis, of course. And the electricity we're using is from Northern Manitoba Treaty 5 territory, and the water that we're drinking here is from Treaty 3 territory. And we recognize that ongoing economic inequality in Canada is inseparable from the history and present reality of colonialism, and that conversations about fairness in wages and work must include commitments to reconciliation and justice for Indigenous people. And today's conversation is an important one because pay equity remains unfinished work across Canada. Even though women have participated in the labor force for generations, significant wage gaps persist, especially for women working in care sectors, racialized women, Indigenous women, newcomers, and women with disabilities. Many of the jobs most essential to keeping our communities functioning, childcare, healthcare, educational support, social services, continue to be undervalued and underpaid because they have been historically treated as women's work. Pay equity is not simply about fairness in individual workplaces, it's about how our economy assigns value. And it raises fundamental questions about whose work counts, whose labor is rewarded, and what kinds of inequality we are willing to accept. And it's particularly timely right now because governments are grappling with labor shortages, affordability, and the need to strengthen public services. And so this is essential to solving these problems. When wages are more fair, recruitment improves, retention improves, and families and communities are stronger. And so Ontario offers some important lessons in this regard. Its experience shows both how difficult progress can lead to legal reform and coalition building, also how there is still a lot more work to be done. There's a lot to learn from the successes and obstacles that Ontario has experienced. So we're very fortunate today to be joined by Fay Faraday, who's a lawyer and social justice advocate and co-chair of the Ontario Equal Pay Coalition. She is from the strategic consulting firm based in Toronto. She's a social justice lawyer, strategic advisor, policy consultant, and academic whose work focuses on constitutional law and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, human rights, labor and employment law, pay equity, employment equity, transnational migrant workers' rights, and public interest litigation. Fay is an associate professor emerita at Osgoode Hall Law School, and she has published extensively on constitutional law, labor, and human rights. And Fay also serves as discrimination and harassment counsel for the Law Society of Ontario, and she is the co-chair of the Ontario Equal Pay Coalition. So she will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. And there is a chat or a Q&A section, I'm not sure which one there, that you can feel free to put questions in there while you listen. And so I'll turn it over to you, Fay. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Molly. I am thrilled to be here, and I think uh, one of the most important things is that I'm actually a Winnipeg girl, and uh, it matters so much to me that Manitoba, which was one of the real leaders in developing pay equity laws, is able to really deliver equality for women into the future. So I'm going to start off with a discussion that sets the stage for where we're at right now, what are some of the legal tools we have, and what are some of the strategic choices that are open to you now? Because I do think that that Manitoba is in um, a, it has opportunities that don't exist in other provinces. And I think thinking strategically about what your real goal is and how to get there is a conversation that I'd like to spark in today's session. It won't give you the answer, but I think it will give you clarity on questions to be asking and strategies to be thinking about. At least that's what I hope. So let me start off. And I'm going to share some slides with you for this first section, just because it's a lot of information and I want to help it be more digestible. So I am, as you have heard, um, uh, the co-chair of the Equal Pay Coalition in Ontario. The Equal Pay Coalition was formed in 1976 by uh, Mary Cornish, who was a leading human rights lawyer, Laurel Ritchie, Madeline Perron, real leading feminist labor unionists, and other women in different women's civil society organizations and inside administrative positions and the public service, who had a real goal of ensuring that the international human rights instruments that Canada had just signed became real. So in 1972, Canada signed the the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination based, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. And the Equal Pay Coalition wanted to make sure that Ontario implemented laws that made that real. So they pushed to have pay equity legislation introduced in the province, but also recognize that that's never been the sole tool that we need to close the gender pay gap. We're still going strong. It's sort of a dubious thing to say we're still here 50 years later, but we are still fighting that fight because the gender pay gap is nowhere near closed. When I talk about the gender pay gap, what I'm meaning is how much less on average women earn than men do. And there's many different ways to measure it. You can measure it by what is the gap in average hourly pay or monthly pay. But the real measure, the one that we rely on, is what are women's annual earnings? Because at the end of the day, that is the measure of whether you can pay rent and pay for food, right? It's not looking at things like the hourly rate in isolation. So we always talk about what are women's annual earnings. And when you break it down, this is these are the most recent figures for Ontario. Manitoba's are not much different. So on average, women are earning 68 cents for every dollar a man makes. But you can see how intersecting forms of discrimination deepen that degree of poverty. So racialized women on average get 62 cents on the dollar, Black and Indigenous women 58 cents on the dollar, women with disabilities 57 cents, and Arab women are the lowest paid in the economy, earning only 53 cents on the dollar. So the average in Ontario is 68 cents on the dollar. The report that CCPA Manitoba put out places Manitoba a little higher here at 71 cents on the dollar. But if you do this breakdown, looking at intersecting forms of discrimination, you get the same decreasing security in the economy. When we look at Canada on the global stage, we're not doing so great. We have the seventh largest gender pay gap among the OECD developed economies. And among the G7 countries, we have the second largest pay gap. And what's really critically important to know is that the gender pay gap affects work in every sector in the economy. Women are paid less than men in 469 of 500 occupations. So this isn't something that just happens in one small corner of the economy. This affects women in every sector, at every level of education, at every age cohort, and into retirement. So what causes the gender pay gap? There's a lot of dynamics that cause it. And, Molly touched on some of this, right? The continuing effects of colonialism, ableism, racism, the austerity politics that have reigned for multiple decades now that have undercut all of the care economy and public services where women are most highly concentrated, the cult of flexible work, which means that work is increasingly part-time and precarious, the attack on union rights, and particularly the undervaluing of care work and the burden of unpaid care work that remains overwhelmingly on women. When we look at women in the paid labor force, there are so many other dynamics that drive the gender pay gap. And all of this is important because when you look at what are the drivers of the wage gap, when you line the laws up with them, the laws only respond to specific ones of these drivers, not all of them. So wage inequality, if we think about just are people being paid, a situation where a man and a woman are doing the same job, but women are being paid less, that situation of equal pay for the same or similar work, that is still a huge problem. So that bare wage inequality based on the work you're doing and based strictly on gender remains a problem, even though it's been illegal literally since before I was born. There's the fact that jobs are very gendered. We still have traditionally female jobs and traditionally male jobs, where men and women are not just doing different work, but often work in separate workplaces. And the more female a workplace is, and the more gendered female the nature of work is, the lower it's paid. There's a lot of barriers to getting hired. There's discrimination in getting hired, in getting promoted and trained. Overwhelmingly, I'll say a bit more about this. Women are concentrated in the most precarious forms of labor. So even if the hourly wage gap doesn't look so large, it's about 20%. When you consider that women work fewer hours, at the end of the day, the gap is much bigger. So that precarious work, not getting enough hours, the unequal unpaid care duties still fall heavily on men. There's very serious barriers to unionizing in female dominated workplaces. And that's because our labor laws were designed around the male factory. But women's work is structured quite differently. Think, for example, care workers delivering home care to people in their homes. They don't know who their coworkers are. They're not all in the same workplace. The laws built for the factory are much harder to implement. But one of the big ones is gender-based violence, and whether that is sexual harassment and sexual assault on the job, or intimate partner violence in women's personal lives, that resonates in the workplace and drives women out of jobs in order to ensure their own personal safety. I talked about the precariousness of work. Women, and particularly racialized and immigrant women and women with disabilities, are concentrated in precarious work. So minimum wage, short-term contracts, working through temp agencies, doing casual work and part-time work. They make up 60% of minimum wage earners. And when we look at that occupational segregation, more than half of women work in just 5 areas of work: care work, cleaning, clerical work, catering, and cashiering. That occupational segregation has remained virtually unchanged for 2 generations. So that's a critical driver of the pay gap. We have a number of different tools that can help close the gender pay gap. There is employment standards legislation. So that prescribes minimum wage rates, right? The requirement that people doing the same or similar work are paid the same without discrimination based on gender. It can include job posting requirements to have the salary range public, right? There's the Pay Equity Act, which deals specifically with addressing the impact of occupational segregation and sex discrimination. So that is comparing female dominated jobs with male dominated jobs, typically within the same employer, and seeing if there's a gap. It's about evaluating the work in a gender attentive way, so that you look at all of the skills, effort, responsibilities, and working conditions that attach to a job, value the job mathematically, and then compare the values and see if there's a pay gap. That's been responsible for identifying quite significant gaps between male and female jobs that is attributable to that occupational segregation. Other tools that we have, obviously, are unionizing and negotiating collective agreements, and that is the number one quickest way to close the gender wage gap. The fact that in a collective agreement, everybody who's in a job class earns the same pay is a really good thing. It makes it really quite transparent. But you still need to do the work of ensuring that the female-dominated jobs are actually valued in a way that reflects their importance in the workplace, and that their pay isn't subject to gender discrimination. So even when you have a collective agreement, it's important to be able to engage that pay equity analysis to make sure that, our history of undervaluing women's work doesn't continue to be baked in going forward. So I'll talk more about that. And we have the Human Rights Code, which is the tool for addressing all forms of discrimination in the workplace. So, and it's not just based on sex, it's based on all of the most commonly used levers of discrimination, like sex, race, disability, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, etc. And that would apply to all parts of the employment relationship, from hiring to access to training to access to promotions to is there discrimination in anything else that's happening on the job, and continuing into access to benefits, termination, the whole thing. So that's the broadest tool. Each of the tools has benefits and drawbacks, but I know that you're in a moment where you're thinking about what are the options to strengthen the laws that are available. What are the tools that we can develop to truly close the gender pay gap? It's important to know that the overwhelming majority of Canadians believe that governments need to do more to promote women's equality, and closing the gender pay gap is one of those top priorities. This is a poll that the Equal Pay Coalition conducted in January 2022, and it's been replicated at both the federal and provincial levels since then. Even the Harvard Business Review says that gender pay gaps shrink when companies are required to disclose them. So I want to just pause there for a moment. And today I want to talk about two main tools for promoting gender equity in the workplace, the Pay Equity Act and Pay Transparency Acts. And I want to talk about what's the difference between them and what are the strategic choices that go into where you put your energies for action and for collective effort. I'm going to start first with pay transparency laws, because in a way, those are easier to understand. And they are things that have been increasingly popular in the last 5 to 8 years. Let me give you, I'm going to go back to my slides and give you a bit more detail about them. What I will say is that Ontario was the first province in Canada to introduce pay transparency legislation. The Equal Pay Coalition had been asking for it for years, and we got fed up of waiting. And so Jan, my co-chair, and I literally drafted legislation, and on Equal Pay Day presented it to the government and said, clearly you don't have time, so we just did this for you. Go ahead and introduce it now, please. And that really spurred them. And within 9 months, we had pay transparency legislation that was not didn't have the depth and detail that we had originally drafted, but had a lot of really key elements that were strong. But then so that was 2017. And later that year, Doug Ford got elected and stopped the legislation from being introduced. So it's on the books, but it's never come into effect. And so that's a critical lesson to learn, that even when you win legislation, you can have the best legislation, but governments change and can easily pull the rug out from under you. But let me tell you what pay transparency legislation is supposed to do. The pay transparency laws are essentially access to information laws. They don't create new rights to equality, but they give you the right to access the information that will let you enforce your existing rights. So, under the legislation that I already showed you, paying men and women differently for the same or similar work has been illegal for generations since the 60s. And but it's been almost impossible to enforce because it depends on individual women coming forward to uh, to say, I'm paid less than that guy over there who's doing the same work as me. In non-unionized workplaces, often employees are prohibited from sharing wage information um, on threat of penalty up to and including termination, especially if you're looking at, um, you know, consulting jobs or professional jobs, the jobs in the financial sector. Um, People are in their contracts prohibited from sharing information. But it's not just in those white collar jobs. That's up and down um, the um, the ladder of um, earnings levels where um, you can be fired for sharing job information. So if you don't know what people in your workplace are being paid, how can you enforce your simple employment standard right to equal pay? The fact is, you can't. And so that provision is almost never activated, right? And so those wage gaps in the non unionized sector are rampant. Pay transparency helps show where women and men are paid differently for the same work. It shows that their work is being undervalued. It also shows where women are concentrated in precarious work, and where they are denied opportunities for training and advancement. So there's pay transparency legislation in different parts of the world, in the UK, and numerous places in Europe, in Australia. And Canadian companies that operate there must already comply with their pay transparency laws. What the laws require is that employers show um, where where workers are concentrated in their workplace based on sex. Like, where are, like, if you divide the earnings into quarters, into quartiles, where are women and men concentrated in that wage hierarchy? And also, what is the gender pay gap in your workplace? So here's an example from RBC. In Winnipeg, under the UK pay transparency laws, we were able to say, look, women's hourly rates, whether you're using the median or the average, are 51% to 57% lower than men's. And when you look at their bonuses, there's an even bigger gap. The median bonus for women is 86% less than men. And when you look at where are women and men concentrated, women are concentrated in the lowest paying part of the employer's workforce, and there are fewer and fewer women as you move towards the higher earning jobs. There was another example, again, massive wage gap, nearly half, right? 47.9%. And again, when you look at bonuses, 84%. And once again, no surprise, women are concentrated in the bottom positions, right? In the lowest earning positions in the workplace. So, what pay transparency laws do are three things. They give protection to workers to enable them to ask for and share wage information. So there must be explicit provisions that say that workers may ask and the employer must provide them information about the wage structure in the workplace, and the gender wage gap, and that workers are protected from any form of reprisal for seeking that information and sharing it. That addresses the do not disclose provisions, right? That people are bound by now. That's one thing it does. The second thing it does is prohibit employers from asking job applicants what they earned in their last job, because that is another big driver of the wage gap. Because when employers ask you, what do you think you should be paid? The women end up being paid lower than men because they have historically been paid, at their previous job they were paid lower than men, and so every time they move, that they bring that gap with them. But it's also a completely unfair bargaining stance, right? You're applying for a job and the employer's saying, what should I pay you? Is they've got all the cards, right? So you're bargaining against yourself, and it's profoundly unfair. um, the uh, so those are sort of the protective things that then let you deal with the guts of the law, which is that the law requires, as I said, every employer to identify the gender breakdown in their workplace, the gender breakdown in terms of where are men and women concentrated in different jobs, what's the gender pay gap, right? What's the gender pay gap, and what is the quartile breakdown in terms of the concentration? So I know that uh, um, Malaya Marcelino introduced a private member's bill to address pay transparency that has not come through. That legislation has some of the elements that I've talked about. It has um, some of the key elements, but at the end of the day, what you get with pay transparency is just access to information. A key part, sorry, that I should mention is that in pay transparency legislation, there's an obligation on employers to file this information with the Ministry of Labor or the appropriate ministry every year, and for that legislation or those reports to be publicly available and searchable. So I was able to get this information about Canadian companies in Europe because there's a publicly available database of annual reports. And so the reports must be annual so that you can track what's happening and if there's any change. That is information that allows women to go into jobs with some bargaining power. And it allows for really important collective action uh, around calling out employers for entrenched discriminatory behavior. So that is replicated throughout um, the economy. But what it really lets workers do is enforce that basic employment standards right to have equal pay for the same or similar work. It can also begin to give information uh, to build arguments for pay equity where you're comparing female job classes and male job classes. So not just on an individual basis, but on a larger collective basis. That's what pay equity is. And Manitoba was the first province in Canada to introduce proactive pay equity laws. That meant that employers did not have to wait, were not permitted to wait until someone filed a complaint before analyzing whether there was systemic sex discrimination in their workplace. Employers and bargaining agents were required to negotiate pay equity. It meant that they had to identify what are the female job classes in your workplace. Those are jobs where 70% or more of the workers are female. So things like if you think about care work, all of those are 90, like high 90s, high 80% female dominated work, cashiering, cleaning. So there's so many jobs, retail, overwhelmingly female. And then you compare them to the predominantly male jobs in the workplace, ones that have 60% or more men doing them, and then evaluate them on that metric of skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. They each end up with a score. You compare the ones with similar points and close any gap that exists in their pay. And those models look at the wage, but it's a total compensation approach. So it looks at the wage, but also what benefits, what bonuses, what commissions, what all different forms of payment. And those must be closed. The shortcoming with Manitoba's law is that it only applies to the civil service, hospitals, and universities. The entire private sector is excluded, as is, the broader public sector of work that may be in part or even wholly publicly funded, but is not strictly part of the civil service, right? And that is where the gaps are largest, frankly. The so there is room for revisiting the Pay Equity Act and broadening and strengthening it so that it is more in line with the legislation that has been adopted across different provinces ever since then. I've been talking for about half an hour, and I'm going to stretch your patience just a little bit more because I want to highlight some of the challenges that we've noticed with these laws. Pay transparency, first of all. It's interesting how in Europe, the legislation has been really embraced. And after it was introduced, people were calling for even greater disclosure, looking at intersectional dynamics of discrimination. So what's the pay breakdown based on race, right? On disability, on immigrant status, on all the other considerations. And that was that's one approach to looking at it. It reflects a cultural valuing of equality, even if it's not implemented in practice. There's still a sense that this is a core value, and it's a bit shaming, right, not to be complying with it. What we see in Ontario, the pay transparency legislation that Doug Ford put in, is a simple job posting provision in the Employment Standards Act, which says that when a company posts a job externally, they must show the salary range for the position. And that range can vary by up to $50,000, which I look at your face and there's like, what? Yeah, there's very few, like, if you're applying for a retail job, there isn't a $50,000 spread. But what is happening in places that have adopted that kind of legislation, and that's the American model, is that employers are actually using that ridiculously large range as a way to hide the gender pay gap, because they will say, we're posting for a social worker, and the range in pay is from $40,000 to $90,000. And they'll hire women at the bottom of the range and men at the top of the range. And so what we're finding is that rather than what the Harvard Business Review thought, that this would actually help close the gap, employers have found a loophole that lets them hide it. Um, so you have like the details of any law matter, and even more than that, the enforcement mechanism matters, and whether the government puts in the resources to ensure that rights are actually enforceable. Because you can have the best laws on the books, but if there's no capacity to enforce the laws, they may as well not be there. Right? Um, which brings us to the experience with pay equity. In Ontario, uh, unless there's been a union, it's been almost impossible to have pay equity plans negotiated in workplaces. In the early days of the Pay Equity Act, there was a publicly funded pay equity advocacy and legal appeals, it was called, Pay Equity Advocacy and Legal Services, that represented non-unionized women in bargaining pay equity with their employers. But that was disbanded in the mid 90s by the conservative government, and non-unionized women have been basically left without because they don't have the capacity to enforce the law. What we've also found is that employers have been coming up with every conceivable argument to say that they don't have to pay equity, as a way to delay payment, so that they just keep kicking it down the line and hope that women will give up. So I just won a huge pay equity case last week that is about maintaining pay equity in the long-term care sector. And employers have been saying, no, you only got to do pay equity once. And once you close that initial gap, we don't have to look at it ever again. But what we know is that discriminatory gaps re-emerge. And unless there is constant monitoring to make sure gaps don't re-emerge, they do, because our society is still profoundly discriminatory, and we are going through a period where that discrimination is even more overt than it was in the 80s when these laws were introduced. And so, this is literally an issue that I have been fighting in this sector for 30 straight years. And the employers and the government are still not paying up. And it's not because they think they're going to win the cases, but because they want to delay it. And what we've seen in legislation that's been introduced more recently in the federal sector is that the legislation is a proactive law, but it's been structured in a way where every advantage is given to the employer, where if the employer and unions can't agree, the employer's position prevails, and that there's no way for unions to file complaints during the negotiation of a pay equity plan. So you basically have to, until the employer actually negotiates a plan, you can't complain about it, which is, when the legislation was introduced, I said we were better off without it. And I know that people are really struggling. There's just been legislation introduced in New Brunswick, and there's a similar, very neoliberal approach to it that is not about ensuring that the rights are enforceable and deliver equality, but putting in place legislation that doesn't actually deliver equality, but prevents you from abdicating for a better law. Because we just did that. We just did that. Try this law.
Yeah.
And so there are, I've been doing this literally for 30 years and watching the resistance to delivering equality uh, is it's really um, it's really shaming. Right?
Hmm.
Lawyers and governments have not delivered on what are absolutely fundamental rights in the labor force. So, but I think, having said that, there are really important strategic opportunities that you have. One being that there is an NDP government in place that has an interest and has made a commitment to addressing um, the pay gap. And so the question is, what do you want to achieve? What's your end goal? And let's talk about strategies for getting there because like I said, I've been doing this, advocating for laws, drafting laws, working with governments for 30 years. And there are many things that you need to have in place to get a really good law passed. And I think that you have the best opportunity in Canada right now to make that happen.
Hmm. Well, thank you, Faye. Maybe we'll take a pause there, but this has been hugely educational and informative, and you've really walked us through so much of the core concepts and the considerations. Because you hear pay transparency, what does that actually mean? Same as pay equity. And I should have unpacked this right at the top, but I did want to just acknowledge the use of identity markers in terms of legislation tends to define gender as man, woman, and sex, male, female, using this binary terminology. And that's also true with data collection. So can you just talk a little bit about how gender diverse folks would fit into this? And because I know that's very important to many people that we be as inclusive as possible. You did talk about female type jobs or traditionally considered that way. That's one way I imagine, but
Well, the uh, when we're looking at patterns of systemic discrimination based on gender in the labor market, the pattern is actually one of coercive heteronormativity, right?
mhm,
It's not about the it's not we're not looking at individual discrimination, we're looking at systemic discrimination, and what it is trying to enforce is the devaluing of work that is coded feminine and the valorizing of work that is coded male, right? So care work um, is an area of work where um, where gender diverse folks, where gay men have been able to find a home because that area of work is open to their femininity, right? So, but the devaluing of pay is based on the devaluing of the feminine
mhm,
as a whole. Like
mhm,
it's about enforcing a gender binary um, in dollar terms and saying, um, that when you do pay equity, everybody in that job class, including cis men who are doing the work, they all get the pay raise because they get the pay equity adjustment. It's not a raise, it's a
right.
human rights remedy, but they all get the pay equity adjustment because they have all been impacted by the devaluing of of the feminine, of
Mhm,
feminized work. What I will say is that it is absolutely true that uh, that gender diverse people face incredible discrimination in the workforce, and uh, that um, folks who have um, affirmed their identity as female see a significant drop in wages, right? Whereas those who've affirmed their gender as male have, in some cases, seen an increase in wages. But that there's so much targeting of individuals, about uh, about shifting along that line of gender identity, which is a different dynamic from systemic discrimination that's trying to keep jobs coded female or male. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's, again, there's a lot of different dynamics that
Hmm.
result in poverty for women and for gender diverse folks. But what is the tool to address the particular dynamic? So the tool that would, like, there's so many different um, uh, dynamics that are happening with discrimination based on gender identity that need different tools other than pay equity.
Right.
But just want to reinforce that pay equity is about coercive gender binary in
Hmm.
your pay.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for unpacking that for us. That's very good too. Different ways of thinking about that. We have about 9 minutes left, and we've had some very attentive people here. So feel free to put any questions in the chat here. Um, and I do have some questions I could start us off for. I do like how you say you've been doing this for 30 years, but you still have some, I think we have a strategic moment here in Manitoba with, I noted it was Malaya Marcelino when she was the critic for Labour in the opposition government, introduced pay transparency private members bill twice, but it was not passed. It was in the NDP's election platform. And so it is something we understand that this government is considering here for pay transparency. And you talked to us about that versus pay equity. Um, but I guess you kind of talked about it already, but my question relates, oh, we have a question in the Q&A here, to, how can we get energy around pay equity here in Manitoba when it seems like, um, what we've seen from other places is it hasn't achieved the results that people have hoped that it has.
Um, it what we have is massive non-compliance
Okay.
from employers with non-unionized workplaces. Where there are unionized workplaces, we have actually seen millions of dollars flow into women's pockets. And, if the decision that I won last week, if that gets implemented throughout the broader public sector, it is worth billions of dollars, which is why the government has been fighting it. So there
Mhm.
have been real transfers of money on a systemic level. The uh, the problem is to maintain the pay equity so that the gaps don't reemerge. Because what we see is that they reemerge, and then you have to close them again, and they reemerge, and then you have to close them again. So it's a constant need to um, uh, to negotiate and for unions to be really on top of it. It
Mhm.
does give um, a legal lever that allows you to get the money in a way that you can't get just at bargaining at the table, right?
Right. Okay.
Because it's an obligation.
Right.
The So I do think there's that, and I think, but sorry, you said that there were other questions. So
Yes. Yeah. Let's get to these two questions. First from Dennis Lewicki. He writes, employer resistance to adaptation of pay equity. Is research on economic benefits of pay equity for employers available, effective?
what 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 you see is that when workers are delivered pay equity compliant wages, they're more likely to stay, they're more motivated. right? Because their work is being recognized for the value that it's at. But what you really see is that the money that women earn goes into the economy in a way that is a multiplier, well beyond the dollars. Because for many of the women who are getting these pay equity adjustments, it means that they're able to pay off debt, they're able um, to pay their kids' school tuition, they're able to buy the necessities of life that make just basic life more affordable. And that's the kind of money that is a multiplier in the economy, which is better for employers as well, right?
Mhm.
It's the idea that low wages are a good thing is very short-term thinking for employers because it ignores the attrition and the costs of having to replace the labor force. So I'll just give an example of, in the childcare system, in the healthcare system, um, there are real backlogs in being able to access services because the pay is so far below what is warranted by the skills that people are leaving those professions in droves. Women are leaving them in droves because they can earn literally more money at Costco, right? So why would they take on all that stress for such low pay, right?
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And then Anna Rothney's question, how is the newish federal pay equity legislation rolling out in practice?
oh, it's a nightmare.
Oh.
There are no pay equity plans in place yet. As far as I know, they should have been in place 3 years ago. What is happening is that they require at the table the employer. There's a single pay equity plan for the entire workplace. So if you think about an airline, right? There's how many unions there? So there's employer reps and union reps and non-union reps on the negotiating table. If the all of the employee side people do not agree unanimously, the employer's position prevails. And so it is um, it is so backlogged. The employers are, you know, uh, retro or reverse engineering their evaluations. So there's no, oh look, there's no discrimination here, right?
Mm.
And there's no leverage to actually get the commission to engage because the legislation hasn't allowed for that complaint process. So, this is why I say it's utterly critical that you have government that is willing to put in that is actually negotiate or drafting legislation that gives workers real power and that is aimed at actually closing the gender pay gap. That's drafted in clear language. The federal act is drafted like it's a tax statute. And even as a pay equity specialist, it's incomprehensible on
Mhm.
purpose because then people think, oh, it's this technical thing. It doesn't have to do anything with my rights, right? Saying men's jobs are paid higher than female jobs is really easy to understand, right? When
Right.
it's put in super technical language, it becomes a blur, right? So
Mhm.
really easy to get workers to disengage from the process. That's
Mhm.
deliberate. Um, but so you have to have that well drafted legislation that is accessible to people, backed up by resources to truly enforce the law. And if you don't have those two things together, that's when you flounder.
Mhm. Well, that might be the best place to end it there because we're coming up to our time. But thank you so much, Faye. This has really been very educational and informative, and in clear language that landed with me, and I hope everybody else who is here. This has been recorded, so we'll send it out to everybody who is on this webinar, and then you can share it with others who weren't able to attend, probably sometime next week. And I also wanted to note that we've been working with the Manitoba Federation of Labor. Who is co-hosting this event. Thank you so much to the Manitoba Federation of Labor for co-hosting this webinar, and also on Equal Pay Day, which is the day into the next year that an average woman has to work to earn the same as a man in the same calendar year, in one calendar year. And so that is coming up. I'm not going to announce it right now, but watch for that press release, and hopefully we get some coverage and can continue this very important conversation and move forward with steps for action. So again, thank you so much, Faye, for everything. And thank you everyone who is here. And we'll be in touch. Okay, thanks everybody. Take care. Bye.